You know what they say about working in deep space? It's 90% boredom, 9% paperwork, and 1% pure unadulterated terror. Guess which part of my day this was turning out to be? My name is Zara Voss, and I'm what the Galactic Council politely calls a xenobiological consultant. What that really means is I'm the person they call when something with too many teeth and not enough manners decides to make first contact. Today's adventure was brought to us by the research station Stellar Drift, which had about as much charm as its name suggested. Boss, get to Docking Bay 3. Now! Captain Krell's voice crackled through my comm unit with all the warmth of a black hole. The Krithari had exactly two emotional settings: mildly annoyed and preparing for war. Today, he sounded like he was somewhere in between. I dragged myself away from my morning coffee, which tasted like someone had filtered it through a gym sock, and made my way through the station's sterile corridors. The Stellar Drift was one of those utilitarian research outposts that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought ambiance was a type of space disease. Docking Bay 3 was buzzing with activity when I arrived. Well, buzzing might be generous. It was more like nervous shuffling with a side of mild panic. Captain Krell stood near the airlock, his forearms crossed in what I'd learned was his "Why does the universe hate me?" pose. Next to him bounced Dr. Finn Brightwater, our resident optimist and living proof that natural selection sometimes takes a coffee break. "Ah, Zara, perfect timing!" Brightwater's enthusiasm could power a small moon. "We have the most fascinating situation here, simply extraordinary." "Let me guess," I said, pulling my scanner from my belt. "Someone found another derelict ship full of something that's either going to kill us all or ask us to join its pyramid scheme." "Close," Brightwater beamed like I'd just solved quantum mechanics. "We found an abandoned Nexari vessel, but here's the interesting part. It wasn't empty." That got my attention. The Nexari were what happened when you took a pack of wolves, made them 8 feet tall, gave them opposable thumbs, and then taught them advanced warfare. They were the apex predators of the Andromeda Spiral, and they had exactly zero patience for other species. Finding an abandoned Nexari ship was like finding a ticking bomb with a bow on it. "Define not empty," I said, though I was already pretty sure I didn't want to know the answer. Captain Krell's expression somehow managed to get even grimmer. 3 juveniles, cubs, alone, on a drifting ship with minimal life support. "Cubs?" I stared at him. "Nexari don't abandon their young, ever. It's literally against their biological programming." "Yes, well, that's what makes this so fascinating." Brightwater practically vibrated with scientific curiosity. "The ship's logs are corrupted, but what we can make out suggests these cubs have been in space for weeks, alone, alive." I looked back and forth between them. Okay, so we've got 3 baby apex predators floating around in space like cosmic orphans, and somehow this became my problem because, Krell said with the tone of someone explaining gravity to a particularly slow asteroid, "You're our xenobiologist, and because Command says we can't just ignore 3 dying cubs, even if they belong to a species that considers us slightly less evolved than their breakfast." "How wonderfully humanitarian of Command," I muttered. "I'm sure the Nexari will send us a lovely thank you card right before they declare war for touching their offspring." But even as I complained, I was already mentally cataloging everything I knew about Nexari physiology, which honestly wasn't much beyond "don't let them bite you" and "their idea of diplomacy involves showing you their teeth." Still, cubs were cubs, regardless of species, and despite what my personnel file said about my antisocial tendencies and inappropriate sarcasm levels, I'd never been able to ignore something small and helpless. "Fine," I said, shouldering my equipment pack. "Let's go see what kind of intergalactic incident we're walking into this time." As we headed toward the docking tube, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to be one of those days that ended with me updating my resume. Again. The Nexari ship looked like someone had taken a sleek predator and turned it into a spacecraft, all flowing lines and angular edges, designed to be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Too bad it currently looked like it had been through a blunder. "Life support's been running on fumes for days," our engineering tech reported as we boarded. "Whatever happened here, it happened fast." The interior was worse than the outside. Claw marks scored the walls, and there were blast marks that suggested some kind of internal struggle. But it was the silence that got to me. Nexari ships were supposed to hum with activity, pack calls, the constant chatter of a social species. This one was dead quiet except for our footsteps. We found them in what looked like a modified cargo hold. 3 cubs, huddled together in a makeshift nest of torn fabric and emergency supplies. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, still covered in the downy fur that marked them as juveniles. They looked up at us with those massive golden eyes that Nexari were famous for, and I felt my professional detachment take a nosedive. "Oh," Brightwater whispered. "Oh my." The cubs were thin, too thin. Their fur was patchy and dull, and when the largest one tried to stand, it swayed on unsteady legs. They were dying, and they knew it. "Well," I said, kneeling down slowly, "this just got complicated." The cubs watched me with the kind of wariness that suggested they'd learn not to trust anything bigger than themselves. Smart kids. When I extended my hand, the smallest one, barely the size of a house cat but with paws that promised future lethality, sniffed cautiously at my fingers. "Can we save them?" Krell asked, and for once his voice had lost its military edge. "Maybe," I said, running my scanner over the nearest cub. "But here's the fun part. According to everything we know about Nexari culture, these cubs have been contaminated by alien contact. Us, specifically. Their own kind won't take them back." "Contaminated?" Brightwater looked horrified. "That's barbaric." "That's survival," I corrected. Nexari packs are incredibly insular. They don't adopt strays, they don't forgive weakness, and they sure as hell don't welcome back cubs who've been touched by other species. As far as their families are concerned, these three are already dead. The largest cub, who I was already mentally calling Trouble, made a soft chirping sound. It was probably a distress call, but it sounded heartbreakingly like a question. Like it was asking why we were there, why its pack had left, why everything had gone wrong. "So what do we do?" Krell asked. "We can't just leave them to die. And we can't exactly drop them off at the nearest Nexari colony," I pointed out. "They'd be killed on sight for being contaminated." "Surely there must be some protocol," Brightwater said weakly. "Oh, there is," I said, standing up and brushing fur off my hands. "The official Galactic Council protocol for dealing with abandoned Nexari cubs is to contact the nearest Nexari authority and let them handle it. Which, in this case, means we'd be handing 3 kids over to be executed." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cubs seemed to sense the weight of what I'd said. "There has to be another option," Krell said finally. I looked down at the 3 small forms huddled together, depending on each other for warmth and comfort in a universe that had already decided they were expendable. The smallest one had fallen asleep with its tiny paw resting on my boot. "Yeah," I said, making a decision that my common sense was already screaming about. "There is. We take them with us, temporarily, just until we figure out what else to do." "Zara," Brightwater said carefully. "Nexari cubs imprint on their pack structure very quickly, if we're not careful." "I know," I said, but looking down at those 3 trusting faces, I realized I'd already made my choice. Whether that made me a humanitarian or just another sucker, I guess we'd find out soon enough. 3 days. It took exactly 3 days for my carefully maintained reputation as a cynical antisocial scientist to go straight down the recycling chute. The cubs had settled into the station's improvised nursery, which was really just a converted storage bay with some soft surfaces and a heating unit. What we hadn't expected was how quickly they'd decide that I was their new pack. Pack, the largest one, who I'd started calling Scout, chirped at me as I entered with their morning meal. "Pack, pack, pack." "I'm not your pack," I muttered, setting down the bowl of synthesized protein that our food processors had grudgingly agreed to produce. "I'm a temporary caregiver with commitment issues." The smallest cub, Pip, ignored my protest entirely and climbed straight up my leg like I was a particularly tall tree. By the time I'd managed to untangle tiny claws from my uniform, the middle cub, Sage, had claimed my other leg as prime real estate. "Zara, this is extraordinary!" Dr. Brightwater burst into the room with his usual enthusiasm, nearly tripping over Scout, who had appointed himself as door guardian. "I've been reviewing the linguistic patterns, and they're not just calling you Pack. They're using the specific inflection that indicates Pack leadership. You're not just a member, you're their alpha." "Wonderful," I said, gently extracting Pip from my shoulder, where he'd decided to take a nap. "Add accidental alien Pack leader to my resume, right under person most likely to cause diplomatic incidents." But even as I complained, I couldn't ignore the warm feeling that spread through my chest every time one of the cubs looked at me with complete trust. It was terrifying and wonderful, and absolutely against every rule of xenobiological protocol ever written. "The bonding process is fascinating," Brightwater continued, pulling out his ever-present datapad. "Nexar cubs typically imprint on their birth pack within hours of hatching, But these three have been isolated for weeks, and their imprinting instincts have redirected to you as the primary caregiver. Lucky me, I said, but I was watching Scout demonstrate his hunting prowess by stalking my shoelaces with intense concentration. For something that would grow up to be an apex predator, he was ridiculously adorable when he pounced. The real problem became apparent when I tried to leave the nursery. All three cubs immediately began what I can only describe as the most pitiful distress calls in the known galaxy. It was like someone had weaponized the concept of abandonment and turned it into a sound. "Pack!" Scout wailed, throwing himself against the door. "Pack no leave, pack stay!" "I have to work," I explained, as if logical reasoning had ever worked on any baby of any species. "I'll be back in a few hours." Pip's response was to climb the doorframe and hang there like a furry, tragic ornament, while making sounds that could melt the heart of a black hole. They think you're abandoning them," Brightwater observed helpfully, "like their original pack did." "Thanks for the insight, Dr. Obvious," I snapped, but I was already reconsidering my exit strategy. That's how I ended up doing my research with 3 Nexari cubs trailing behind me like the galaxy's most dangerous ducklings. Scout appointed himself as my personal bodyguard, growling suspiciously at anyone who came too close. Sage claimed responsibility for carrying my smaller tools, dragging them around in his mouth with obvious pride. And Pip seemed to believe that his job was to provide moral support by purring constantly and occasionally licking my ear. "You know," Captain Krell observed on day 4, watching Pip attempt to help me calibrate equipment by batting at the controls, "I don't think I've ever seen you this relaxed." "I'm not relaxed," I protested. "I'm compromised. There's a difference." Krell said, but he was trying not to smile as Scout presented him with a chewed-up stylus as an apparent peace offering. The truth was, I was getting attached. Dangerously attached. These weren't just subjects for study anymore. They were 3 small, fierce, incredibly smart individuals who had decided that I was worth following around the galaxy. Scout was the natural leader, always checking on his siblings and testing boundaries with the kind of intelligence that would make him formidable when he grew up. Sage was the thinker, constantly exploring and examining everything with scientific curiosity that reminded me uncomfortably of myself. And Pip was pure joy wrapped in fur and claws, finding wonder in everything from floating in zero gravity to the taste of synthesized fruit. "They're changing you, you know," Brightwater said quietly, as we watched the cubs play together in the observation lounge. "They're temporary," I replied, but my voice lacked conviction. "Are they?" he asked. And that was the question I wasn't ready to answer. Because somewhere between teaching them to use the sonic shower and watching them figure out how to work together to steal food from the upper shelves, I'd stopped thinking of them as an assignment and started thinking of them as mine. Of course, the universe has a sense of humor about these things. Just when I was starting to think we might actually pull off this whole temporary guardianship arrangement, reality came knocking. And by knocking, I mean it announced itself with enough firepower to turn our little research station into cosmic dust. "Zara, get to the command center, now!" Captain Krell's voice over the comm had reached a new level of grim that I didn't even know existed. I was in the middle of teaching the cubs how to properly use eating utensils, which mostly involved Scout trying to figure out if a spoon could be weaponized, Sage attempting to disassemble a fork to understand its structural integrity, and Pip wearing a bowl as a hat. You know, normal Tuesday morning activities. "Stay here," I told them, which was like telling a supernova to please keep it down. "I'll be right back." The command center's main view screen showed 3 ships that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought subtle was a 4-letter word. Sleek, predatory, and bristling with enough weapons to sterilize a small moon. Nexari hunting vessels. My blood went cold. "They've been broadcasting for the last 10 minutes, Krell reported. "The translation matrix is having trouble with some of their dialect, but the general message is pretty clear. They want their cubs back." "And by want them back, you mean—" "They want to cleanse the contamination," Dr. Brightwater said quietly, his usual enthusiasm completely absent. "According to their transmission, the cubs have been corrupted beyond redemption by prolonged contact with alien species. The mercy they're offering is a quick death." I stared at the ships on the screen, each one easily 10 times the size of our station. How merciful of them. "Zara," Krell said carefully, "we have to consider our options here. We're a research station with minimal defensive capabilities. They're a hunting pack with enough firepower to crack this station open like an egg. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," he said, and I could hear how much he hated the words coming out of his mouth, "that maybe we should comply with their demands. For the greater good, for the safety of everyone on this station. I looked around the command center at the faces of people I'd worked with for months. Good people. People with families back home. People with dreams and plans and futures that didn't involve being vaporized because of 3 alien cubs they'd never even asked to rescue. "How long do we have?" I asked. "They've given us 1 standard hour to prepare the cubs for transfer," Brightwater said. They're actually being quite reasonable about it from their perspective." "Reasonable," I repeated. "Right, because executing children is so much more palatable when you give a hour's notice." That's when the proximity alarm started going off. The cubs had figured out how to open the nursery door because, of course, they had. Scout came bounding into the command center first, followed closely by his siblings, all of them chittering excitedly about their successful escape. "Pack," Scout announced proudly, like he'd just conquered a small planet. "Pack, find Pack." The Nexari on the view screen went very, very still when they saw the cubs. The lead hunter, a massive specimen with scars crisscrossing his muzzle, began speaking rapidly in their native tongue. "He says the contamination is worse than they thought," Brightwater translated, his voice tight. "He says the cubs have been adopted by the alien pack structure. He's asking how we managed to corrupt their natural instincts so completely." "Corrupt?" I looked down at Pip, who had claimed my leg as his personal climbing tree and was currently purring loud enough to be heard over the ship's engines. "All we did was feed them and keep them warm." "That's not how they see it," Krell said grimly. "To them, you've turned their cubs into something unnatural. Something that doesn't belong to any pack." Scout seemed to sense the tension in the room. He moved closer to me, his small body radiating protective instincts that would have been adorable if they weren't so completely useless against starship-grade weapons. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone I'd never heard from him before. "Pack Prime," he said, and the words hit me like a plasma bolt to the chest. The silence in the command center was deafening. Even the Nexari on the view screen had stopped talking. "Did he just—" Krell started. "Pack Prime," Brightwater whispered. "That's not just Pack Leader. That's the highest position in Nexari's social structure. It's reserved for the Alpha of Alphas, the one who leads entire clan groups. The cubs just declared Zara the supreme leader of their pack," Krell said slowly, "in front of a Nexari hunting party." I looked down at Scout, who was staring up at me with absolute trust and determination. Sage had positioned himself at my other side, and Pip had stopped purring to watch the view screen with the kind of intensity that suggested he understood more than we'd given him credit for. The lead hunter on the screen began speaking again, his voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like awe. "He says this is unprecedented," Brightwater translated. "He says no alien has ever been acknowledged as Pack Prime by Nexari cubs. He's asking if we understand what this means." I looked at the 3 small forms arranged around me like tiny bodyguards, ready to face down ships full of their own kind if it meant protecting their chosen pack leader. My throat felt tight. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I think I'm starting to." The lead hunter spoke one more time, and this time his words carried the weight of finality. "He says they cannot simply execute cubs who have chosen a Pack Prime," Brightwater said, his voice filled with something that might have been hope. "But they also cannot allow the contamination to spread. He's invoking something called the right of challenge." "Which means?" "Single combat," Krell said grimly. "You, against their champion. Winner takes custody of the cubs." I looked at the view screen, where alien predators the size of small buildings were preparing to settle a custody dispute the old-fashioned way. Then I looked down at 3 cubs who had decided I was worth fighting for. "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this should be interesting." 30 minutes later, I found myself standing in the station's main cargo bay, which had been hastily converted into what the Nexari generously called a combat arena. It looked more like a place where cargo containers went to die, but apparently it met their standards for ritualistic violence. The Nexari champion was a specimen that evolution had clearly spent extra time on. 8 feet of muscle, claws, and attitude, with scars that told the story of a very successful career in making other things dead. His name was something that sounded like gargling gravel, so I mentally dubbed him Scarface. "You know," I said to Captain Krell as I checked my gear one last time, "when I took this job, nobody mentioned the possibility of dying in single combat with an alien apex predator." "It was probably in the fine print," he replied, but his attempt at humor fell flat. "Zara, you don't have to do this. We could still try to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" "They want to execute 3 kids because they got attached to the wrong species. Some things aren't negotiable." Dr. Brightwater was practically vibrating with nervous energy. I've been studying their combat rituals. Traditionally, it's a fight to submission or death, but there are certain rules. No weapons beyond natural abilities, no outside interference, and... He paused awkwardly. And the cubs are supposed to witness it. It's part of the ritual. They need to see their chosen pack prime prove their worthiness. I looked over at Scout, Sage, and Pip, who were huddled together near the viewing area. They'd been unusually quiet since the Nexari had come aboard to set up the challenge. Scout kept making soft, reassuring sounds to his siblings, but his golden eyes never left me. Great, I muttered. No pressure at all. The lead hunter, who had introduced himself with a name that roughly translated to renders flesh from bone, but whom I was calling Steve for my own sanity, approached me with what might have been respect. For a species that communicated largely through displays of teeth, it was hard to tell. Human pack prime, he said in carefully pronounced standard. You understand the terms. Combat until submission or death. Winner claims custody of the cubs. I understand, I said, but I want to add something to the terms. Steve's ears flicked forward in surprise. You wish to modify the right? When I win, I said, ignoring the snorts of disbelief from his hunting party, the cubs stay with me, permanently. No more contamination concerns, no more execution orders. They're mine. And when you lose? Scarface rumbled from across the arena. I looked over at the cubs again. Scout had stood up and was pressing against the barrier, his small claws extending in distress. If I lose, you get 3 kids who will spend the rest of their very short lives knowing their pack prime died trying to protect them. Hope that sits well with your warrior honor. The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse a small star. Finally, Steve nodded slowly. Terms accepted. May your death bring honor to your pack. Wow. Thanks for the pep talk. The fight started about as well as you'd expect when a middle-aged scientist faces off against a creature that evolution had specifically designed for killing things. Scarface opened with a casual swipe that would have taken my head off if I hadn't spent the last few years developing excellent reflexes for dodging dangerous alien wildlife. Come on, Zara, I could hear Brightwater shouting from the sidelines. Remember, Nexari rely heavily on frontal attacks. Use your agility advantage. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one trying to avoid becoming a cautionary tale about human hubris. I rolled under another swipe, and managed to land a solid kick to Scarface's knee joint. He barely noticed, but it gave me an idea. Nexari were built for power and intimidation, but they were also heavy and relied on momentum. If I could stay mobile, maybe I could tire him out. For the next few minutes, it was like the galaxy's most dangerous game of tag. I dodged, ducked, and occasionally got in a hit when he overextended. But I was already getting tired, and he was barely breathing hard. That's when Scout did something that changed everything. Pack Prime, he chirped from the viewing area. Remember teaching, pack work together. And suddenly, 3 small forms were climbing over the barrier and onto the arena floor. Wait, Steve shouted. This is not permitted. The combat must be... Actually, Brightwater interrupted, consulting his hastily downloaded files on Nexari law. If the cubs choose to participate, they're within their rights. The Pack Prime has the authority to call upon pack members for support. I stared at the 3 cubs who had just entered a combat zone to help me fight a creature 20 times their size. Guys, get back behind the barrier. This isn't safe. Pack fight together, Scout announced with the kind of determination that could move planets. Pack protect Pack Prime. What happened next was something that no amount of xenobiological training could have prepared me for. The cubs spread out around Scarface, moving with a coordination that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Scout took point, drawing the big male's attention with a series of aggressive barks. Sage circled around to the left, while Pip, barely the size of a house cat, somehow managed to climb up Scarface's back and start batting at his ears. It should have been suicide. 3 tiny cubs against a trained warrior, but something magical happened instead. Scarface stopped attacking. He froze in place, staring down at Scout with an expression I'd never seen on an Nexari face before. Wonder. Impossible, Steve breathed. The cubs they are fighting as a coordinated pack, with an alien as their alpha. Pack Prime strong, Scout declared, positioning himself between me and Scarface. Cubs strong too. Pack together strongest. Sage had somehow managed to tie Scarface's ankle claws together with a piece of debris, while Pip continued his campaign of adorable psychological warfare from his perch on the warrior's shoulder. They're not just fighting with you, Brightwater said in amazement. They're teaching him. They're showing the adult Nexari how pack bonding works across species lines. And that's when I realized what was really happening. This wasn't about proving I could beat a Nexari warrior in combat. This was about proving that family doesn't have to be about species or genetics or tradition. Sometimes it's about choosing who you'll stand with when everything goes wrong. "Yield," Scarface said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been reverence. The arena fell silent except for Pip's triumphant purring. "What?" I said, because my brain was still catching up to the fact that I was apparently still alive. "I yield to the Pac Prime and her cubs," Scarface repeated, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This pack bond is stronger than any I have witnessed. The cubs have chosen well." He knelt down to Scout's level, and for a moment I thought he might be preparing for a final attack. Instead, he touched his forehead to Scout's in what I recognized as a gesture of respect between equals. "Fight well, little Alpha," he rumbled. "Your Pac Prime has trained you with wisdom." Scout's response was to lick Scarface's nose, which pretty much broke every rule of Nexari social interaction ever written. And that's how I accidentally revolutionized interspecies diplomacy, by teaching 3 alien cubs that family is what you make it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my newly expanded office aboard the research station, watching Scout attempt to explain quantum mechanics to Pip using hand gestures and a lot of enthusiastic chirping. Sage had claimed the corner by the window as his personal library, where he'd built an impressive fort out of xenobiology textbooks and stolen furniture cushions. "Through the Galactic Council is still trying to figure out how to classify your situation," Captain Krell said, settling into the chair across from my desk. He'd taken to bringing coffee during our weekly status meetings, which was either a sign of respect or an indication that he'd given up on military protocol entirely. "Let me guess," I said, scratching behind Pip's ears as he climbed into my lap for his afternoon nap. "They're calling it an unprecedented diplomatic anomaly, and hoping it goes away if they ignore it long enough." "Close. They're calling it the Voss precedent, and they've asked me to submit a full report on human pack bonding behaviors." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Human pack bonding behaviors? We don't have pack bonding behaviors. We have commitment issues and an alarming tendency to adopt anything that looks at us with big sad eyes." "Apparently, that's the same thing," Krell said dryly. "The Nexari have submitted a formal request to establish diplomatic relations with humanity, based on what they're calling our superior pack integration protocols." "Superior pack integration protocols," I repeated slowly. "They want to establish diplomatic relations because we're good at making friends with aliens. Better than that, Steve, or Renders, Flesh from Bone, as he prefers to be called, has declared you an honorary Nexari Pac Prime. You're apparently the first alien in recorded history to hold that position." I looked over at Scout, who was now drawing complex diagrams on my whiteboard that looked suspiciously like battle plans for capturing the lunch cart. "I'm pretty sure I didn't sign up for this level of responsibility." "None of us did," Krell admitted. "But the Nexari aren't the only ones taking notice. The Crystalline Collective wants to study your adoption methodology. The Thermal Dynasty thinks you might be able to help them with their juvenile delinquency problem. And don't get me started on the requests we're getting from single-parent species across 3 sectors. "Wait, what?" I stared at him. "Single-parent species, that doesn't make sense." "Apparently, word has spread about the human who successfully raised 3 apex predator cubs using nothing but patience and synthesized protein paste. You're being hailed as some kind of interstellar parenting guru." Dr. Brightwater burst through the door with his usual enthusiasm, nearly tripping over Sage, who had expanded his fort to include a complex tunnel system that now covered half the office floor. "Zara, wonderful news. The Xenobiological Journal wants to publish our paper on cross-species pack bonding. They're calling it groundbreaking research in applied interspecies psychology." "It's not research," I protested. "It's just 3 kids who needed someone to take care of them. 3 kids who have revolutionized our understanding of pack dynamics across species barriers," Brightwater corrected. "Do you realize that Scout has developed his own hybrid communication system that incorporates elements of human body language? Sage has started exhibiting problem-solving behaviors that suggest he's learning to think like both a Nexari and a human. And Pip has taught half the station crew how to purr." I glanced over at the communications station, where Ensign Martinez was indeed making soft, rumbling sounds while he worked. It was oddly soothing. "The point is," Krell continued, "what you've accomplished here goes far beyond just saving 3 cubs. You've proven that families can transcend species barriers, that pack bonds can form based on choice rather than genetics. The implications for interstellar relations are staggering." Pack Prime Wise, Scout announced from the whiteboard, where he'd apparently given up on lunch cart conquest in favor of drawing what looked like a family portrait. It showed 3 small figures standing next to one larger figure, all of them with disproportionately large smiles. Pack Prime, make good pack. See? Brightwater beamed. He gets it. I looked around my office, which had been transformed from a sterile workspace into something that looked like a cross between a laboratory and a very chaotic nursery. Sage's book fort dominated one corner, Scout's various projects covered most of the available wall space, and Pip had claimed my desk chair as his personal napping spot, which meant I now did most of my work sitting on the floor. It was messy and loud and completely contrary to every professional standard I'd maintained for the past decade. It was also the happiest I'd ever been. You know what the really funny part is? I said, watching Pip dream chase something in his sleep. Everyone keeps talking about how humans are these great pack bonding specialists, like we've got some kind of genetic superpower for making friends with aliens. Don't we? Krell asked. Not really. We're just stubborn enough to keep trying when everyone else gives up, and maybe we're a little too stupid to know when something is impossible. Or maybe, Brightwater suggested with uncharacteristic seriousness, you're compassionate enough to see family where others see obstacles. Scout finished his drawing and brought it over to show me. In addition to the family portrait, he'd added what looked like a spaceship surrounded by various alien figures, all holding hands or tentacles or whatever appendages they happened to possess. Big pack, he explained proudly. All species. Pack Prime teach everyone. I stared at the drawing, at this vision of interstellar harmony created by a cub who 6 months ago had been dying alone on a derelict ship. Oh no, I said, realizing where this was all heading. They're going to want me to replicate this, aren't they? They're going to expect me to go around the galaxy adopting alien children and solving diplomatic crises through aggressive hugging? Probably, Krell admitted. The Council has already approved funding for something they're calling the Interspecies Family Integration Project. Guess who they want to head it up? I looked at Scout, who was now helping Pip with some kind of engineering project that involved my coffee mug and several paper clips. I looked at Sage, who had emerged from his fort to present me with a flower he'd somehow grown in a beaker using hydroponic nutrients and sheer determination. Well, I said, accepting the flower and trying not to think about how my quiet research career had somehow turned into a calling to revolutionize galactic civilization, one adopted alien at a time. I guess there are worse ways to accidentally change the universe. Pack Prime, best Pack Prime, Scout announced with absolute certainty, climbing into my lap to join his napping brother. And you know what? Looking at these 3 impossible kids who had decided that a cynical human scientist was worth calling family, I was starting to think he might be right. The universe was a big, scary, complicated place, full of species that didn't understand each other, and problems that seemed too big to solve. But maybe, just maybe, it could also be a place where family was something you chose instead of something you were stuck with. Where pack bonds could form across the vastness of space and the barriers of biology. Where 3 small cubs could teach the galaxy that love doesn't care about species classifications or diplomatic protocols. Of course, if anyone asked, I was still going to claim this was all a happy accident. After all, I had a reputation to maintain, even if that reputation now apparently included galactic adoption specialist and interspecies pack dynamics expert. The cubs were never going to let me live this down.